Muito obrigado, Karima. É um prazer para mim estar aqui na vela terceira para este congresso da APDR. Muito obrigado a todos, e particularmente a Tomás Dentinho, por me dar a oportunidade no meio de uma pandemia. I think my Portuguese goes up to there. I'm just going to try to switch to English. And normally I like to talk walking around the room, but today, since I'm going to talk without a mask and in the middle of the pandemic, and I think this is being recorded, I'm going to stay put here. I think it's probably the safest. The topic I'm going to be dealing with, and please, Karima, let me know when I got 5 minutes more or less, I can brush, is about institutions and development, which I think is very topical today because many of the problems that are associated to institutions and the reaction and the impact on development can be associated to the quality of institutions and the situation of the pandemic that Eduardo just talked about. And what I'm going to start by doing is mainly by looking at what I think the problem is and where the problem lies. We have been looking at economic growth, at economic development for the best of 70 years. If you push me, I can go for 100 years, but in reality it's 70 years. And in that period, our theories have improved significantly. Our methods have become much more sophisticated, and none the least our data has improved enormously. Yet, we're still at loggerheads with what determines growth. We actually know less, or we believe we know less now about what determines economic growth and economic development than we did 30 or 40 years ago. In fact, what we've been trying to explain for a long time, economists, but also a lot of social scientists, is how do we generate more jobs and how do we generate greater income? How do we produce an economy that is dynamic and goes all the time upwards? And we had a formula that was based on the neoclassical growth theory that was then modified by different theories, endogenous growth, new economic geography, which basically came to say that it was very simple. You had three types of capital: physical capital, human capital, and innovation, technological capital. And when you put those and you made different investments, what it led to greater economic growth. Of course, there was a part that we didn't know what was created. It was mainly down to chance or other factors, which is what we called, or was called, the residual factor or the error term. What has happened over time? What has happened in the last few decades? Mainly since the 1980s, as I said, our theories, our methods, our data has improved. But what has happened is that we now explain much less on the basis of infrastructure, human capital, and technology and innovation. And we are actually, sorry, I just have to go back, not explaining a lot because the residual term, the part that we didn't know, has grown. To the extent that if you go to countries like Italy and you're trying to explain economic growth over the last 4 decades on the basis of those 3 factors, you explain absolutely nothing. And there are reasons for that. Well, I mean, our policies have been affected before this. We think that our policies have worked for development, and the impact has grown over time, so there's a learning curve, but there has been a decline to the returns of many types of intervention. I'm going to put some examples. Sometimes I put examples from Portugal, but since I am in Portugal and I am Spanish, I'm going to be putting examples from Spain about the type of intervention that we have had over the last 30 years and what the implications are. This is since the reform of structural funds. Spain is today the top country in the world in terms of high-speed rail per capita or per GDP. Is second only to China in absolute terms, but of course China is, 9 million, probably 18 times the size of Spain in size. In population is much more, is 1.5 billion versus 47 million. And in Spain, despite having all this fantastic network that works very well, it's great, of high-speed rail, we end up with a lot of, empty stations like this one. This is the Expo station in Seville that was opened for the Expo in 1992. it sees one high-speed train. It has seen one high-speed train in these 28 years. So namely when the former King of Spain and Queen of Spain went to open the expo. Now this station gets one train, one commuter train an hour. And the day I took the train, I was the only passenger. But it's not the only example. Talking about high-speed rail, again, sorry, I just went too fast. What we have here is this, the high-speed rail between Toledo, Cuenca, and Albacete. You probably know where these cities are. And this is from the satirical magazine El Jueves, but it's absolutely true. It was closed in 2011, 10 months after it was opened. Why? Because the cost was 18,000 euros, just maintenance per day. And the transport was 9 passengers per day, 2 trains, 1 in each direction. Of course, you can see that it didn't make sense. I work in London. I am from Madrid. In London, we have 1 ring road, the M25, which is most of the time congested. In Madrid, we have the M30, the M40, the M50, 3 ring roads, 2 half ring roads. I mean, there's some congestion before the pandemic, some times of the day, but it's marginal in comparison to what we see in London. And we have massive amounts of motorways going in all directions from Madrid, coming into the center, that have been duplicated by toll motorways. Some of the toll motorways don't carry any cars. The Madrid-Toledo, Madrid is 6.4 million, the second largest city in the European Union at the moment, after the UK has left. And from 6.4 million to Toledo, which is about 80,000, what you get here is about 700 vehicles per day. With 700 vehicles per day, you don't need a motorway. What you need is a third, not even a secondary road. You need a dirt track. And then airports, you have airports everywhere. This is the airport in Castellón, but I'm going to put my favorite, which is the airport in Ciudad Real, which is a PPP, so public-private partnership airport that was opened a few years ago and at the cost of 1 billion. And this seems like a joke, but it's from the FT. In July 17, 2015, it was announced that the Spanish Coast Airport in Ciudad Real, that had seen no planes apart from the Almodóvar plane for one of his last films, the penultimate film, was put into auction, and the biggest offer was by a Chinese citizen by just 10,000 euros. Of course, it was not sold for 10,000 euros, but it was sold later on for a fraction of the price it had cost. But of course, you can say this is one of the reasons why is this happening. Why are we putting all this money into that? It can be worse, because in Spain or in Portugal, maybe a lot of our infrastructure investment and a lot of other investment doesn't make a lot of economic and social sense, but at least it's there. You fly into Lisbon, and it's amazing, I always tell my students to do it. What you see is a network of motorways all over. But you can have worse situations. This is the case of Italy, don't look at Hugo Chavez there, but I'm going to focus on the case of, since I'm here, on the case of Greece. This is the A1 motorway in Greece, the Athens-Thessaloniki. Greece has received the same amount of money, more or less, as Portugal for investment. In the case of Portugal, you got motorways. You have the best endowment of motorways in the world relative to population. But you got motorways going everywhere. You have 3 motorways in parallel at some points between Lisbon and Porto. It took the best of 40 years to finish one motorway, and they didn't have the money to build a bridge over here to save 50 kilometers of the motorway. So it can be worse. The money can simply disappear. And the question is why? Why do we have this? Why is this? Are we investing in the wrong things and therefore we're not achieving the returns that we are expected? And the solution probably comes that if we look at what has determined the growth of our residual factor, it comes from something that we can know as institutions. Institutional quality, formal institutions, so from the rule of law, the preservation of public property, or private property, to informal institutions from trust, corruption, etc., that are transparency, accountability, that are fairly common problems in many parts of the developed world, but especially in the developing world. And they count much more than they used to do, at least in explaining why not just we are not growing relative to the amount of resources that we put, but also why some other policies don't achieve the stated goals. And we didn't work too much on institutions because we struggle on how to measure institutions. And still it's very, very difficult to measure institutions and institutional quality. But we're getting better, and we're getting better even at subnational level. This is work that has been done by the Institutional Quality Institute at the University of Gothenburg. And here, what they map is the institutional quality of regions in the European Union. And this is the last one they've done. They've done 3 waves, about 80,000 surveys per wave, looking, and it's a more complex picture than a simple east-west dimension. What you have is some parts of Europe that are have very good institutions, the Nordic countries, for example, Bavaria and Germany. But then you have other areas which are not just in the south or in the east, they are concentrated in the southeast, Greece, Croatia, Romania, Bulgaria, and the south of Italy, that have got the worst institutions. And somewhere in between lies the rest of Europe, regions in Europe. And this is how the map has changed. I'm going to dwell later on a bit on the Iberian Peninsula, but you can see that institutions can also change over a relatively short period of time. I put here the Iberian Peninsula. You can see in Portugal there's relatively little change over the last 10 years, 12 years now. In the case of Spain, by contrast, you see that the colors are getting darker, so there has been a deterioration in the quality of institutions. But this is not something just for Europe. We're trying to do this now for other parts of Europe. With Min Jiang from Suzhou University, we've mapped institutional quality at cities in the case of China, and we're doing also, we're also doing that for Africa at regional level for countries where we got sufficient data. And the question is, how do these differences and significant differences in quality, institutional quality, actually affect the returns of public policy? And there are 2 ways. One is the direct way. It implies that if you have bad institutions, then you're going to end up with subpar economic growth and employment generation. The other one is the indirect way, that whatever policy that you put in place, public policy, is going to be tainted by weak institutions. So the policy is going to be subpar, suboptimal, and you're going to get less returns. Let me start with some indications. And this is, sorry, I don't want to bore you with data, but it's just to indicate that there's a lot of analysis behind each of the assertions that I put here. Let me start with the direct impact in terms of economic growth. When you have, in general, good institutions, you put in place, and this is simple, good policies, and those good policies deliver greater economic growth and employment generation. When you have weak institutions, the policies tend to be always weaker, so you end up with less of an impact. And this is something that Enrique Garcilaso and myself from the OECD have studied. And we have looked at how putting more money into places with weak institutions actually led or did not lead to greater territorial outcomes. And what we found that there was a lot of thresholds. There were important thresholds. When you put very little money, the impact is, When we put very little money, the impact is generally positive, but is when you put 20 euros per capita in Paris, with 20 euros in Paris you can buy a beer, so it doesn't make a lot of impact. If you are in the Azores and you put the best of a lot of money, or in Madeira, then you can make a big difference, because you are somewhere around here. And we find that there are thresholds. So let's suppose we have this graph and we have different thresholds in which you have levels of cohesion expenditure here, and then we have growth of GDP per capita. If you put a threshold of 80 euros per head, you have a level of growth in excess of what would you put, that is 0.5%. Then if you go to 100, it goes up, and it goes up in blue here when you go to 120. But beyond 120, you're stuck. The more money you put into areas with either low or with a certain quality of institutions, you don't grow more. So the best way to achieve more development is not to pump more money beyond that level, but to put more money into, or more resources into, improving the institutional quality. These are the examples. For example, what we find is that beyond 80 euros, quality of government is a far more important predictor of economic development, economic growth, change, than the money you allocate to territorial development. And we have put numbers to that. So you can see at the different thresholds, you get normally above 80 euros that improving one standard deviation in quality of government leads to about 4 times more growth than putting one standard deviation in terms of greater resources. And beyond 120 euros, the returns of investing more in cohesion in Europe as a whole, it doesn't mean that in every region that's the case, stop. So we have this conundrum that if you want to make the same impact of overcoming the problems of poor governance and poor institutions, you probably need to multiply the amount of structural funds by 2.7 times. Tell that to the Dutch, or tell that to the Germans, they're going to say no. You probably need to reform institutions in that respect. Second is in employment. This is work with Marco Di Cataldo. What we find is that if you have better institutions, you tend to create more jobs, but the important thing is not the amount of jobs you create, the quality of the jobs you create. That intervention then leads to the creation of highly skilled jobs in certain sectors that are more likely to survive and be resilient and be able to cope with economic problems. You also have, when you have weak institutions, you not only create less jobs, but most of those jobs tend to be precarious or low skilled, that are more vulnerable to changes in the economic cycle, or at the moment to changes related to, for example, the pandemic of COVID-19. But there are also indirect effects. And you're thinking, like most governments think, you pump more money into research and development and you achieve greater innovation. So there's this whole idea that still dominates in Europe, this whole idea that in order to achieve more innovation in a country like Spain or Portugal or in Italy, you need to increase levels of investment in research and development, which in Spain are 1.2%, which is not different from Italy, and then you're going to achieve that. But Spain, between 1995 and 2008, right before the crisis, doubled its R&D expenditure, and its innovation capacity did not grow. Why? Because, once you standardize quality of government between 0 and 1, so 0% and the minimum and the maximum, you see that if you have very low quality of government, it doesn't make that much of a difference for your capacity to innovate. When you are above 80%, it doesn't make that much of a difference, but between 30%, which is somewhere around here, and 80%, quality of government determines massively your returns of any type of investment in innovation. Same is for infrastructure, and this is something that you would be familiar in Portugal and I'm familiar in Spain with. When you have weak government quality, in this case, poor government quality tend to decide that they want to invest in big projects. So everything else being equal, you go for a motorway rather than for a secondary road. The more you improve the quality of government, also in less developed countries and in less developed regions, what you have is a more equal tendency to invest in secondary roads that very often address bottlenecks and motorways. And the important differences in the returns in economic growth and in jobs. The more motorways you put in the way they have been put in Europe in recent years, the less you grow and the lower returns. When you invest more or in a more balanced way in secondary roads and motorways, you end up with much bigger returns in terms of employment and economic growth. And finally, it also depends on your level of development. If you are in Eastern Europe and you're still very far away from the average of the European Union, putting a lot of money into infrastructure, human capital, and technology is still making the trick. The old recipe is still working. When you are in the south of Europe, where there has been a lot of investment in mainly infrastructure, to a lesser extent in human capital and technology, that is not yielding the same results. What yields the same results is fundamentally improvements in human capital, in institutions, and investment in human capital, which in many countries has been relatively in short supply. So this is what we know at the moment, but we still need to grapple and improve our knowledge about institutions and quality of government and how they work in terms of promoting development. First, we need to understand much better how institutions change. There has been this tradition of thinking coming from political scientists, Robert Putnam, for example, that if you're the south of Italy, there's nothing we can do. And then you're stuck. You've been like that for 7 centuries, and whatever we do is not going to work. But we know that institutions change, and they can change relatively quickly. And some countries, I'm going to put the Baltic states, Estonia has been one of the countries with the best improvement in institutions. It's also one of the most dynamic countries in Europe. Its neighbor Latvia, with a very similar history and very similar economic and social conditions, has improved institutions to a much lower extent and is much less dynamic from an economic perspective. And that's what we need to understand. Why in some countries are institutions improving, in some regions improving, in other regions they are declining. Second is how institutional change impinges not just on the traditional things that we have looked at, jobs and employment, but also on other factors. Like, for example, the well-being of citizens, the sustainability of an economy, sustainable from an economic, a social, and an environmental point of view. And this is one of the topics Francisco said is the fashionable word at the moment, resilience, the capacity to rebound from crisis, which is very high in places like Sweden or Denmark. It has been much lower in places like Greece, for example. And then also, we need to expand institutions beyond what we are looking at subnational level at the moment, which is corruption, is transparency, is accountability. It's mainly government quality and government efficiency, into other types of institutions, like, for example, diversity, openness, for example. And we also need to understand the mechanisms. Is this link between institutions and improvements in all the other factors that I mentioned, which is employment or growth or sustainability and well-being, and how do we need to do that? Finally, we need to improve policy, because it's one of the chicken and egg question. If we're going to get better returns, we need to make sure that our policies are more up to scratch, and that implies improving the transparency, the accountability, the efficiency of all decisions that are taken by public institutions, in this case by governments. And in order to do that, we need to keep an eye on what are the best practices, how has policy improved in certain places, and what has worked and what hasn't worked in certain regions. But this is something that none of us can do alone. It's something that I am a geographer, I work mostly with economists, but it's not just a single discipline. We need lawyers, we need political scientists, we need sociologists, we need engineers to be aware of these problems, but also to contribute and to make sure that we move along in the right direction. And we as regional scientists can provide that house to combine all these forces in a way that would make any type of intervention not just much more efficient and transparent, but also much better at delivering well-being with the limited resources that we have had in the past and that we're likely to have in the future as a group in Europe, but also elsewhere, after a crisis and the need of a response like the one we have had with this pandemic. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Andrés. Thank you, very interesting. Questions, suggestions? Well, I need also more questions from the audience, not only from Peter. Who can help me here? Questions, suggestions? If not, I will walk to a person. No? Oh, okay. There's one question? Okay. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the presentation. I was very curious about what justifies, I don't know if you know how to answer this, but if you don't know, no problem, just think about it. when we see the map of Portugal, depending on the years, you might have 2 or 3 different colors. And I was wondering what is behind that. What is the reason, for example, for Alentejo, which has a very low density of population, to have brighter colors, so they're better from the institutional point of view than the rest of the country, or the northern part of Portugal, which is actually very active from the economic point of view and the development of view, as a poor color compared to the rest. What are the criteria behind those colored maps? Well, Portuguese reality is the one I know better, but I was really curious about it. Thank you.
Unfortunately, I don't have the map of institutional quality in front of me anymore. But you have to look at how this map was compiled. It's mainly based on a number of questions that are put together by the Quality Government Institute at the University of Gothenburg, and it's a subjective map. So it is a map that is based on surveys of individuals living in the region. If you had asked me 25 years ago or 20 years ago when I started working on this, whether I would trust subjective data on institutions, I would have been very, very skeptical. The more I know about data, the more I know about how supposedly objective data are compiled, the more skeptical I am about objective data, the more happy I am about subjective data, and especially in terms of institutions. Because in institutions, in institutional terms, when we're looking at, for example, trust, the traditional way of obtaining objective indicators was by the drop wallet experiment. I leave the wallet over there and hope that you are not going to steal it from me. But first, it's a very difficult experiment to conduct. It's very expensive because I suppose that you, as and Sao, are not going to steal it from me. But what happens if you steal the wallet from me? Then I have to get another one. So it's very complicated. Or the Putnam type of experiment. How efficient is the government? You write to the government and you wait for the government to respond. And of course, the problem is that you might get into the more diligent civil servant, or you might get into the weaker civil servant. Unless you repeat the experiment a lot of times, it's not going to work. And finally, also with the transparency and the fairness of the justice system, the efficiency of the justice system, is mainly measured in terms of days it takes from being sued to getting a final verdict. And you say in Italy it takes 500 days, in Sweden it takes 100 days. Ergo, the Swedish system is far better than the Italian system. But by that method, the best justice system in the world is the North Korean system, because you don't get any time between being accused and being sentenced. So here what we're doing is a question of, is subjective. So how happy are individuals with their local governments and with their provincial governments or their regional governments? And there might be a lot of factors that go into it. It might be education. People, if they are more educated, they are more critical than people that are less educated. But once you control and you start looking in detail, you can see that these data are normally very well made. There might be slight changes. But one of the things you should be proud in Portugal is that for a country with a country that has improved, but still relatively low level of GDP, among the old members of the European Union, you have the best institutions. And these institutions have remained stable in a period in which, in other countries, institutions have gone through a comparable turmoil. 12 years ago, according to those maps, there was no difference in quality of institutions between Portugal and Spain, and they were very, very similar to the level of France. France has improved, Spain has gone down, Portugal has remained where it was, which is slightly below the average for the whole of Europe.
Thank you, Andrés. Thank you for your question. We have one question. Very short, please, because later on we have a discussion on this.
It's a very short question, and it's related to the first question. You have shown how institutions impact development, if they are better or worse. My question is there any factor within the weakest institution that can explain better how they perform worse? I mean, corruption, lack of knowledge, other?
Yes, there's one pattern. Normally, when you have weak institutions, you have They are highly correlated. I mean, the 4 indices that they has been reduced to 3 in the last turn, but in the first 2 rounds, they were doing 4 indices, which were corruption, government efficiency, voice and accountability, and rule of law. They are all extremely highly correlated. So the problem is that if you have a region where you have low transparency and accountability, normally you also have high levels of corruption, weaker rule of law, or weaker efficiency in the justice system, and also you have weaker government efficiency. Unfortunately, that's the case. It's not that normally when they improve in conjunction. When they decline, they go in the same direction in conjunction.